Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome to our presentation today. I'm Glenn Howard. I'm president of the Jamestown Foundation, and we're delighted to be sponsoring this event today, which is entitled Bulgaria, Russian Espionage, Security, and Politics. Russian espionage is certainly not new for Bulgaria, but the uncovering of an activist espionage network within the Ministry of Defense of a NATO member state is shocking, if not a very serious incident. Last month, Bulgarian authorities made public that the group was providing classified information to the Russian embassy in Sofia. Russia's emboldened espionage operations, its economic penetration through energy projects and real estate holdings, support for local pro-Russian organizations and political parties, along with a massive disinformation campaign, signify growing interference in Bulgarian politics and undermine Sofia's position in the European Union and in NATO. Well, in which direction then is Bulgaria heading? Well, we don't know that quite, but today the newly assembled parliament in Sofia opened. We're going to have a conversation today with some prominent experts on the intersection of Russian subversive activities and Bulgaria's domestic politics. And leading the way for Jamestown is none other than Jamestown Foundation Senior Fellow, Margarita Assenova, who will moderate the session. Margarita, take us to where we're going today. Next stop, Bulgaria.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone in the United States. Good evening to those who listen to us in Bulgaria. Bulgaria is the poorest country in the European Union, and according to different surveys, it's the most corrupt member as well. The revelation that a Russian spy network has penetrated Bulgaria's security structures indicates that the country is also one of the most vulnerable NATO members, a weak link in NATO, as Mark Kramer recently wrote. The latest spying case is perhaps the most significant exposure of Russian espionage operations in the country since the end of the Cold War. Well, they didn't need to penetrate to have espionage during the Cold War because their Russian operatives and their servants were everywhere in the security structures and elsewhere. First, nevertheless, this case involves penetration of Bulgaria's most important security institutions. This is the Ministry of Defense. Secondly, the spying ring included several high-ranking defense ministry officials, particularly military intelligence officers. Then Moscow has apparently targeted not only Bulgaria's defense plans, but also information related to NATO, the European Union, the US Embassy in Sofia, and the CIA. And lastly, that spying ring was organized and coached by a ringleader who was trained by the Russian military intelligence, GRU, in Moscow back in the 70s. Moscow's intelligence operations in Bulgaria have intensified since 2019, when the government decided to upgrade the country's air force with American F-16 fighter jets and gradually retire most of its Soviet-era aircraft. Since then, 8 Russian diplomats have been expelled from Sofia for espionage related to the country's military plans, defense production industry, the energy sector, and the elections. As serious as the situation looks, however, most political parties, as well as the president of Bulgaria, Rumen Radev, have remained largely silent. The new parliament, which opened today after the elections earlier this month, did not seem to be too concerned with such serious security challenges. It was mentioned briefly, but not really a focus of what the parties are going to be doing in parliament. The parliament itself is very fragmented. It has 6 parties, and none of them is a clear winner. The current ruling party had only 25%, got only 25% of the vote. And since every other party is against it, it will probably not be able to form a government. But the next largest party is a newcomer in Bulgarian politics with no clear platform. So far, we have not heard a really clear ideology behind the party called There Is Such a People. This party might form a government with the support of the Socialist Party, the successor of the former Communist Party in Bulgaria. And given the hardened pro-Russian line of the leadership of the Socialist Party, we may see changes that are not similar, that are different from the line before. It could be much softer attitude, much softer response to routine Russian spying on NATO and EU in Bulgaria. And of course, such developments could affect negatively Bulgaria's standing in NATO and the European Union. We have a distinguished panel today to discuss the cross-section of Russian espionage, security and politics in Bulgaria, as Glenn said. Dr. Mark Kramer, Director of Cold War Studies Project at Harvard University's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Dr. Ognyan Minchev, Professor of Political Science at Sofia University and also with the Institute for Regional and International Studies in Sofia. And Dr. Velizar Shalamanov, member of the Bulgarian Parliament, newly elected. He is from the center-right Democratic Bulgaria party, which carried the success of a party that carried the most important reforms in Bulgaria since fall of communism. He also served as Minister of Defense and Deputy Minister of Defense, as well as in leading positions in NATO structures. But let me start first with Ognyan Minchev, Professor Minchev, who is going to give us an assessment of Bulgaria's vulnerabilities to Moscow's subversion operations and how they affect internal politics. This is an important part of the equation. So welcome, Ognyan, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Margarita. I will try to provide the context of the analysis that my colleague Velizar Shalamanov and other participants could, of course, go deeper into the security aspects of it. I'll start from the broader network, going into the core of the problem. First of all, Bulgaria, in its modern history, has always been a country with two faces. One pro-Western face, which is modernizing, progressive, whatever you call it, and more Eastern face, which is actually focused on tradition, cultural affinity, and so on and so forth with Russia. So this double face is the two faces of Bulgarian politics have always been present, and they have recovered as political orientations after 1989. And the pro-Western part of Bulgarian society and Bulgarian political class actually won the battle for bringing Bulgaria into the institutions and the mainstream of what we call the West as a member of the NATO and the European Union. Yet, even if we manage to receive those two memberships, institutional memberships, Bulgaria remains a borderline country. It is a country on the border between Europe, the Middle East, and Eurasia, and the influences coming from all those three directions are influences which are shaping Bulgarian politics and Bulgarian public opinion, moving it closer to the one side or to the other side. And Russia and Turkey, apart from Europe and the United States, have always been and continue to be important factors influencing Bulgarian politics and Bulgarian public opinion. That's the broadest framework of what we can start with speaking about the Bulgarian politics. Secondly, I would like to point out that in Bulgaria, we are having a strong structural presence of Russian interest. We have to remind that the end of communism was differing in a way compared to the end of Nazism or fascism after the Second World War, because the end of communism actually was peaceful, it was transformative, and the direct consequence of that fact is that the political elites and the societal elites which we inherited from the communist past remained as legitimate elements of public, political, and societal discourse after 1989. That factor contributed to the status quo in which Russian interests embodied into the former elites of the communist past, which persist in a transformed way after 1989, already more than 3 decades. Those elites have actually developed, preserved, and developed their special relationships to Russian institutions, Russian authorities, Russian corporations, and Russian flexible relationships on a personal basis, on family basis, and so on and so forth. We have to remind that Russian influence on Bulgaria throughout this period of 30 years has always been very important in 2 aspects, which are guaranteeing for the Kremlin, for Moscow, its strong influence upon Bulgaria, even if Bulgaria is already a member of the EU and the NATO. The first field of that direct structural influence is energy monopoly. Bulgaria continues to have the lion's share of its energy system dependent upon Russian supplies and Russian infrastructure, both in liquid fuel, in gas, in nuclear energy, and so on and so forth. And that energy monopoly actually produces energy prices and energy benefits for the Russian party. Part of those profits made by the energy monopoly status of Russia are going back to propaganda in favor of Russian presence and Russian domination throughout Bulgarian society, in media, in social networks, and so on and so forth. The second very important factor, which is a factor of Russian structural influence in Bulgarian state and society, this is Russian presence and influence in the system of corruption at the high level of power, at the high institutional level. The system of corruption which is being fed by Russian presence in the institutions are actually guaranteeing policy decision-making, which is in favor, in many cases, is in favor of Russian interests in the country, in the energy field, and in other fields. Following from that structural presence of Russian interest, we have to point out at the next step, we have to point out that policy making in Bulgaria is very much dependent upon that influence. You cannot bypass Russian interest in Bulgarian politics, because if you are trying to bypass it or do bypass it, you get sanctioned. Many Bulgarian prime ministers and high-level officials have experienced what does it mean to get a hit from Russian authorities or Russian sources if you bypass or if you resist Russian interest. The now going out Prime Minister Boyko Borisov experienced that in 2013. He says that was because he sanctioned and approved separate Bulgarian program of gas extraction from the Black Sea Shelf. But I think that apart from that could well be one of the reasons, but apart from that, the protests and resignation of Borisov in 2013 was also a consequence of the fact that under his government, first government, the major Russian energy projects have been stopped or postponed. I mean, the Bellini power plant project, Burgas-Alexandroupolis oil pipeline project, and also the South Stream pipeline. It was postponed and practically blocked under the next government of Oresharski in 2014. Russian energy projects have always been an important part of Russian influence upon Bulgarian policy making, and we are experiencing that influence until the present day, when the third government of Boyko Borisov, which is just going out now, resigning today, has agreed and performed this extension of the Turkish Stream project, cutting through the territory of Bulgaria, going to the Serbian border. We have to go a little bit beyond the Bulgarian context of that Russian influence, stating also that the Balkan Peninsula is a complicated area in terms of energy. Energy networks and energy competition in the region is following different logics, different patterns of logic. And Bulgaria in the last decade and a half, is facing a reality in which major gas pipelines, for example, are bypassing the country. I mean, the Nabucco pipeline did not take place, did not happen. Major pipelines, TAP and TANAP, came through the east from Azerbaijan through the territory in Turkey directly to Greece and Italy, leaving Bulgaria on the side. So if Bulgaria wants to be part of this network, in this case of gas pipelines, it had to listen or stick to some Russian projects like South Stream in the past, which was terminated under the pressure of Brussels, and now the Turkish Stream, which has been implemented, has been constructed to replace the South Stream. But what is the difference? The difference is that the South Stream would be going directly to Bulgarian territory, and Turkish Stream is going to Turkey, and from Turkey coming to Bulgaria, including Turkey into the power energy equation to which Bulgaria is being subjected in this case. This is an important. I'm just marking certain aspects of the regional energy competition and situation in order to provide some example of the controversial nature of that economic and political influence in the region. The next point which I would like to make is the point related to the when we speak about Russian influence in Bulgaria in the field of security. And energy is field of security. Corruption is the field of security, apart from the more narrow security aspects of military issues and special services security issues. But the policy agenda of Western countries and Western factors like the European Union and the US matter when we speak about Bulgaria dependence upon Russian interest and Russian activities in the country and in the region. I would say that both the strategies of the EU, if we speak about at all about the security strategy of the EU, elements of that kind of strategy we can put, but the strategy of the US priorities relating to the Bulgarian situation, we have to admit that that kind of security interest, that kind of policy attitudes of Washington in particular are quite limited, selective and defensive. Bulgaria does not have a high priority status in US policy making, and this has its consequences. Selective US policies towards Bulgaria are directed in the last at least 2 decades in 2 major dimensions. First, to avoid Russian energy monopoly in the country because it is strategically unfavorable for the West. And second, to limit the high level corruption, the corruption at the high level of power, because the corruption is the major instrument of providing Russian and extending Russian interest in state systems, institutional systems like Bulgaria and other Balkan countries. So we can't speak about diversified, broad, and flexible European and as well as American strategy of maintaining security balance with a Russian interest in Bulgaria, even if Bulgaria is a member of NATO for the last 17 years and maybe a member of the European Union for the last 14 years. my time expires, and so I have to stop. And I'll be ready and glad to answer the questions that I may receive.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. And let me continue with Dr. Shalamanov. Bulgaria's position in NATO, is it threatened by increased Russian intel operations and hybrid and cyber warfare? What shall the parliament do to strengthen Bulgaria's security and limit Russian interference, particularly in the defense sphere? Your experience as a former defense minister, in defense ministry structures before that, and in NATO would probably give you the best view of this question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margarita, for the opportunity. And yeah, I will share something in this area, but I really have a high interest of listening to others and to be able to answer some questions. So what I want to stress on is, as Ognyan started, is on the context, but in more specific aspects you just mentioned, in order to give some examples with practical cases of my experience, in order to define problems and solutions, and especially what could be achieved in 2021. When it comes to the context, there are three main points. First, the position of Bulgaria in NATO. Definitely, Bulgaria is a critical element of this belt from Norway to Greece and Turkey. And this dimension, north-south dimension, is quite important in Bulgaria, and in other discussions, we mostly focus on east-west. But actually for Bulgaria and for NATO and EU, this north-south line is very important to strengthen the border of our community. Simply because in this belt, Bulgaria has a very fragile position with border with Russia on the east in the Black Sea, and border with Serbia. That is not very stable element when it comes to NATO and EU. And third is the importance of position of Bulgaria, the resilience of Bulgaria in this situation for the overall consolidation of southeastern flank of NATO, having in mind all the problems in the Black Sea, Eastern Mediterranean, and Western Balkans. So this position is actually putting Bulgaria as a high priority for the Russian interests when it comes to intel operations, hybrid operations, cyber operations. And because of the specifics of the Russian doctrine, focusing very much not just on collecting information, but influence and active measures, this is really making this approach quite high level of threat for Bulgaria. And third is the context is related to the vulnerabilities of Bulgaria. I think Bulgaria is a specific case because even during the communist period, there were no real Soviet troops deployed in Bulgaria, but there was deep penetration of advisory network and physical presence on the human basis inside our military command structure, inside our secret services, as well inside our education and research system, in every aspect of life, but first of all, secret services and defense. And this deep penetration cannot be easily overcome without active measures. Second, I will not go in detail because Ognyan mentioned this and actually explained very well. It is the high level of dependence in the area of energy, but I will add the defense sector and education and research. And the third element of our vulnerability is lack of will for change during the last several years, especially after 2004, 2007, when we joined NATO and EU. And instead of really taking more radical measures to reduce this influence and to improve the resilience of the country, actually we were living in situation with with these networks being quite active. So 3 practical examples. One example is from 1999 during the Kosovo crisis, when as deputy minister, I was feeling presence of this Russian network very, very really. And when we started to collect enough data, the whole of government data, we realized that actually Russian intelligence together with Serbian intelligence is activating networks, including Bulgarian former military, activating paramilitary organizations, and actually starting a very strong campaign using political parties, in this case, the Bulgarian Socialist Party, writing letters to Milosevic and actually organizing kind of resistance against the decision of the government to provide support for NATO operation, including air corridors. The problem was that with all the evidences, it was very difficult to make a real case and to start the process of cutting these networks. There was one very important step. It was expulsion of the Russian attaché, Navy Captain Lomakin, who was very active and who was the one that was already exposed from Poland, but suddenly appeared in Bulgaria and operated without enough attention from our authorities. So this is one example. I will not go deeper. The second example from my personal experience is actually from 2014, when I was Minister of Defense in caretaker government. And we prepared this Vision 2020, Bulgarian, NATO and European defense, where the hybrid threat from Russia, the information campaign of Russia, Russia using through their secret services influence in part of the political parties in Bulgaria, was characterized as a high threat to our security and to our position in NATO and EU. And the reaction was really unexpected for me, because I was coming from NATO. After 5 years in NATO, I expected that Bulgaria is already really country with NATO spirit. I realized that the reaction was coming practically from all the political parties, except Reformist Bloc at this time, in pushing me as Minister of Defense to delete this text of the vision. That was kind of our mandate for the summit in Wales. And of course, the government that was elected by the parliament after that, the second government of Borisov, decided not to pursue this policy on addressing hybrid cyber and intel threat coming from Russia, and to strengthen our cooperation inside NATO and EU in order to protect the interest of Bulgaria. Instead of this, the second and third government of Borisov actually followed all the interest of Russia for Turkish Stream, for reactivating Bellini, and for actually blocking any initiatives of NATO for the Black Sea region. And it was one of the reasons written in action plan to be divided in 2 parts for Northwest Europe, that is moving very fast with enhanced forward presence, and to identify tailored forward presence for the Black Sea region that is actually very limited and providing flexibility for Romania that is moving quite fast. But nothing is happening in Bulgaria. Actually, even the rearmament programs were blocked, and all the money again started to go to Russia for maintaining of the Russian equipment. The only breakthrough is this deal with US for F-16, but it was more of a gesture for Prime Minister Borisov to tell US, don't bother me, I will buy airplanes for US, but you will close your eyes for everything else I'm doing in the region. That obviously is not going to work in the future, but gave some space for maneuvering. The third most important case is the Novichok case, that I want to share because it happened in 2015 when some of the oligarchs of Bulgaria decided to take over the defense industry and using this as an opportunity to further penetrate in the NATO community, especially in the area of rearmament and providing munitions in NATO standards. So this case is actually before the Salisbury case in UK, and the real interest was raised after the Salisbury case. But first, the Bulgarian government was actually the only one in NATO that didn't support UK and other allies against Russia, didn't take any measures, and tried for many years just to hide that similar case took place in Bulgaria even before UK, that 3 Bulgarian citizens were poisoned with symptoms very similar to Novichok, and that actually the same operatives of GRU that were identified as involved in the case in UK were involved in the case in Bulgaria. And still, this investigation is not giving results. And our government, the outgoing government, is not asking for real help, actually rejecting the help for this organization for prohibition of chemical weapons and the help from other NATO countries to finalize this investigation, because it is very clear this investigation will give clear evidences of the real activity of not just Russian intelligence, but active measures on Bulgarian territory. So not going further, what are the key problems that I see? First, very weak parliament. The previous parliament finished with 10% support in public, and it is because the parliament was fully ignored by the prime minister and the government, without any parliamentarian control, without any role of the parliament over security sector and the investigations that could give opportunity for citizens to understand what is going on. Second, quite weak institutional arrangements in the area of counterintelligence and counter-hybrid and cyber warfare. Bulgaria still don't have any reasonable center for hybrid warfare protection and cyber operations, countering cyber operations, and practically no real coordination and cooperation in the framework of NATO, where what is going on, including in the framework of European Union. And I could mention as a problem lack of strong multinational presence and capacity on our territory. We see what is going on in Romania, we see what is going on in Greece, we see even what is going on in North Macedonia. Bulgaria is kind of a white hole on the map when it comes to such activities that could bring more attention and improve capacity of the country. So solution from my point of view is really a real review of national security system. Such was started in 2019 by the current government, but nothing happened. This review produced no real report to be brought to the parliament with proposal for change. So it is needed, and it is needed to align this review with kind of Vision 2030 for improvement of our national security system, aligned with NATO 2030 view, and aligned with our agreement for strategic partnership with US, because all these are interrelated. Second, definitely we need radical change in education and training, as well as vetting of the next generation of military and security services officers and specialists, because as it is seen from the last espionage case, practically the GRU cooperatives in Bulgaria are embedded in the education and training of the next generation of our intelligence and counterintelligence people. It means the problem will go on, and this has to be radically cut. And last but not least is the next government under the supervision of the parliament to really take seriously the challenge of radical rearmament of Bulgarian armed forces and cutting dependencies from Russian systems and Russian support. It is not possible to have in one air base F-16 and MiG-29 when you have Russian engineers and Russian military serving MiG-29, when you have all the commanding officers, MiG-29 pilots, because they are more senior, and at the same base you to have F-16 with tactical data links, with IFF and other classified equipment that is operated by junior officers under the kind of leadership of the pro-Russian military commanders. So it is just not possible. But for the last 2 years, after signing the contract of more than 2 billion Bulgarian levs, nothing happened to get rid of the Russian equipment and to prepare not just infrastructure, but the command structure and counterintelligence capacity to be able to operate NATO classified equipment with a high level of security. That is not just security for Bulgaria, but security for NATO, and to provide opportunities. I will finish with this, to really think about the multinational formations, multinational air base, multinational naval base, multinational special operation forces that will really bring capacity in Bulgaria to be a strong element of NATO instead of being a weak element of NATO in this very critical area. Is it going to change in 2021? It depends very much on the ability of this parliament to elect government soon, and it depends on the results of the upcoming presidential elections. So this year, 2021, is really crucial, and if we are not able to make the serious steps forward in resolving these problems, I don't expect we to have positive results in next 5 years. So I will be happy for questions and actually advice in these areas. Thank you.
We are already getting some questions, but let me ask Dr. Kramer the most important question. You know Bulgaria very well, including its Cold War past and the current political challenges. You follow what is going on in Bulgaria, what the perceptions are within the country, what the attitude is towards the institutions, and at the same time, what the West thinks about Bulgaria. How does all this picture look to the United States and NATO? What are the security questions that are being raised for the United States and NATO policymakers?
Well, I would say the Ognyan Minchev rightly mentioned, I think, that Bulgaria, even though it has had a close relationship with the United States over the last 30 years, and particularly over the last 10 years, it at the same time does not figure prominently in most US policymakers' minds. That said, the new Biden administration in the United States did react to the revelations of the spy network in the recently disclosed spy network in Bulgaria, expressing full support and offering assistance to try to determine the scope of Russian penetration in Bulgaria. So that did grab people's attention. But beyond that, too, as both of my colleagues have mentioned, is that the presence of the new F-16s. F-16s are an old plane. That is, they go back 40 years. But the ones provided to Bulgaria have been thoroughly modernized. So they're not the most advanced U.S. plane, but they're sophisticated aircraft. And therefore, the possibility that they had somehow been exposed to Russian agents, as it did seem in light of some of what was captured on the surveillance tapes that were released, really generated alarm. And so from the standpoint of the U.S. government, these security questions are extremely important. But they're not the only questions, in the sense that, again, my colleagues very aptly conveyed the extent to which Bulgaria is dependent on, or at least it has a high degree of dependence on Russia in various spheres. This, by the way, is one thing I would emphasize, just to put it into a larger context, is Bulgaria is part of a more general Russian approach to the Balkans, especially to not as much perhaps to Romania, although even in Romania, but certainly everywhere south, that it's part of a larger Russian approach to the Balkans. I should note there's a very good essay on Russian security strategy in the Balkans by Nadia Boyagieva that appeared in a book that came out a couple of years ago on Russian security policy, edited by Roger Panay. And in that essay, I think it shows that the approach taken, say, in Montenegro, where the government was nearly overthrown by Russian agents, or as I think it was Velizar who raised the question of Russian operations in North Macedonia to try to foment tension with Greece and therefore thwart the entry of North Macedonia into NATO. That didn't work, but there were certainly active disinformation and propaganda campaigns to try to do that. So there is an acute consciousness on the part of the US government that this region really needs to be solidified. And clearly the countries that are already in NATO, Bulgaria and Romania got in earlier, but more recently there's also been the entry of Montenegro and North Macedonia and Albania. So it is a region that potentially is a larger weak link in NATO. But there's also the more troubling, again, contextual issue is that this extends beyond the Balkans as well. If you look at what's going on in Hungary, where the Hungarian government is openly trying to align itself with Russia. This is Viktor Orban's government, and is making no pretense of trying to reduce Hungary's dependence on Russia. It's doing the opposite. It's leaving Hungary highly vulnerable. So where it begins to extend throughout the former Warsaw Pact countries, it becomes extremely troubling. The other factor I would bring up here from the US government's perspective is there is an awareness that Bulgaria right now is in a potential period of government instability, because the way the vote worked out on the 4th of April, it didn't give a clear path to a government, because no one wants to work with GERB, which had been the ruling party of Borisov. And so they have the largest number of seats in the parliament, but no one will work with them, and they don't have anywhere near enough to form a government on their own. And then the party that came in second, Imetakov Narod, the name of a former album of the music album of the leader of that party, Slavy Trifonov, is a party that doesn't at least obviously have much interest in actually governing the country. Now, maybe they will change, but certainly during the campaign, there was no clear indication of what they stood for beyond certain somewhat ridiculous claims about the pandemic. And then the selling point of there is such a people that has been this bitter cynicism toward the establishment and this sort of angry defiance, but not a clear indication of what can be done to fix the problems. So that leaves a serious question of whether a government can truly be formed, at least a stable government. Maybe there'll be an ad hoc government formed through different members of particular parties who will, on certain issues, align. But that's not a good way to have a stable government. And with the revelations of Russian penetration in Bulgaria, particularly as was discussed, that this extended to the Ivan Iliev, who was the former military intelligence officer in Bulgaria and had been trained in the Soviet Union in the mid-1970s, and was the ringleader of this espionage network. He had been training the up-and-coming Bulgarian military intelligence officers. Presumably, he wasn't just training them in tradecraft. He was looking for people who could potentially be turned and enlisted for Russia. And that raises the very troubling question of how extensive the penetration is. I know there are people in the Pentagon, in the US government, who are worried about that, particularly because there are sensitive equipment that US military personnel use in Bulgaria, as well as the Bulgarian armed forces themselves. And so there is a great desire to have a Bulgarian government take this issue seriously and investigate it as thoroughly as possible and take effective measures against it. And at a time of government uncertainty and potential no government for the next several months, that is a very difficult task. I do think there are people, including my colleagues, but especially Velizar in the parliament, who do take this issue very seriously and want to focus on it. There have been statements about the status of the Chief Public Prosecutor's Office, which was the office that did the investigation on the Russian network and announced the arrests last month. But still, it remains to be seen who will be proposed to fill that office in the future government. Beyond that, though, there is also, finally, and I will try to wrap up here, is just to say there is also the question of whether there, given the various factors that have been raised about Bulgaria's links, including some of that Ognyan Minchev raised about the Russian crime networks that have operated in Bulgaria. Those, if anyone wants to look at some of the ways these really perverted politics in Russia under Sergei Stanishev's government, you can look at the WikiLeaks documents that were made available. These are US government documents, and see the extent to which this alarmed the then, initially, I guess this was the Obama administration, but the extent to which there was this penetration. Now, some of that has been curtailed, but there remains a great deal of it. And therefore, the question is, given these various links and unsavory ties that Bulgaria has to various Russian agencies, including intelligence agencies, that is there in the near term, at this time of potential government instability, any realistic chance that these issues can be dealt with seriously? So that's what I would say about the perspective from the US government. Again, I play no part in the US government. I have no desire to, but I have a pretty good sense of where sentiments lie in Washington.
Thank you very much, Mark. I would like to continue with the questions that we're receiving on the Q&A chat here. The first question is I'll start with Mark Walters' question. With the knowledge, the acknowledged advanced state of US-Romanian military cooperation, what is the state of bilateral relations between Bulgaria and Romania in the security sphere? probably Velizar Shalamanov would answer this one.
Yeah, first of all, Romania is very active in cooperation with US and inside NATO. So Romania is hosting a multinational brigade where Bulgaria was invited, and we have symbolic participation. Romania decided as part of Readiness Action Plan to establish multinational division Southeast. Bulgaria was invited to participate, so there is such participation, but it's quite symbolic as well. Now Romania is working to have multinational core Southeast. And in addition to this, we all know about equipment that Romania is procuring from US, including anti-air missiles, Patriot, and artillery, reactive artillery. So comparison is that Romania is moving very fast in close cooperation with US and hosting multinational formations from the NATO force structure. Bulgaria is not hosting any multinational formation. Even the multinational brigade Southeast Europe that was established in 1999 and hosted in Bulgaria for 4 years in Plovdiv, when it was achieved as agreement to be hosted more or less on permanent basis in Bulgaria with the support of US. The second government of Borisov rejected this in the last moment, and now the brigade is actually in North Macedonia as a headquarters. So cooperation between Romania and Bulgaria, we just signed the agreement for shared air defense, so it is good to step forward. But again, in Romania we have on rotation practically permanent presence of the Allied Air Force elements, when in Bulgaria it is very, very limited. The proposal that President Iohannis made for kind of joint Navy forces was rejected by Prime Minister Borisov in his second government, and it was really bringing us close to diplomatic scandal, because after the visit of President Iohannis and the kind of agreement he received from the President Plevneliev and the negotiations with Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the statement of Prime Minister Borisov was actually putting all this in a situation to not being able to discuss this further on. Current, because there was such a question, of course, during the visit of Prime Minister Borisov to US, it was proposed that there will be Maritime Coordination Center in Varna, and it will be proposed to be part of the Northwood Operation Center to be responsible for the Black Sea, but things are not moving at all, because it requires real vision, it requires investment, and it requires decisive action. So it is not happening. So in this sense, there were a lot of proposals from Romania, most of them rejected, because it is considered as something that will influence relations with Russia. I will mention such a simple example as joint procurement and operation of air defense radars, 3D digital radars, that is essential for Bulgaria. Currently, Bulgarian air defense rely on the radars that are older than missiles. It means older than 60 years, without any real capability for normal surveillance, tracking, and IFF capability. So it is probably long answer, but we need radical change in this area, especially in Navy and Air Force. Otherwise, there will be no capacity for Bulgaria to maintain air and maritime sovereignty proper way.
Thank you.
If I could just briefly add,
sure.
Could I just briefly add? With regard to Romania, I mean, Romania had severe problems during the communist era, and especially in the under Nicolae Ceausescu, where it became increasingly tyrannical in the 1980s. But one thing that did make Romania quite different from Bulgaria is that Ceausescu, from the mid-1960s on, greatly reduced Romania's role within the Warsaw Pact. It remained a Warsaw Pact member and continued to have ties, but there weren't, for example, Romanian military intelligence officers being trained in the Soviet Union. So you wouldn't have an equivalent to an Ivan Iliev in Romania. And similarly, the different pro-Russian support networks that organized with Moscow's assistance in Bulgaria in the 1990s and 2000s, like Nikolai Malinov's network, the Russophiles National Movement. There's no real equivalent to that in Romania. So that, even though there was concern when Romania came into NATO, there was concern about possible Russian influence in the Romanian intelligence services. Nonetheless, it is quite a different situation in that regard, Romania versus Bulgaria.
I absolutely agree. There is also a very different sentiment towards Russia in Romania due to Moldova. The grabbing of the territory of Moldova by the Soviet Union completely changed the dynamics between the people. So there is no such warm sentiment among many Romanians as we see in Bulgaria. And the other country that's been very successful in a way to counter Russian influence in the Balkans has been Albania because of the same reasons. So the channels that Russia is looking for are sentiment, acceptance, and strategic corruption. This is the most important tool of penetration is the strategic corruption. Let me ask here a question by Lubomir Topalov. It concerns the Russian citizens who are living permanently in Bulgaria along the Black Sea coast. Whether they present any challenge to the national security of Bulgaria as a potential opportunity for Moscow to extend its influence in the country and even potentially to use alleged violation of their treatment as a cause for humanitarian intervention akin to the interception conducted in some former Soviet Union. In other words, does the concept of Russian world extend to the Bulgarian Black Sea coast? Ognyan, probably you would want to answer.
Well, it could. In certain circumstances, it could extend to the Bulgarian Black Sea coast. On the other hand, Bulgaria is already a free country, and we believe it to be a free country. And this is why Russians who would like to purchase property and respond to the preconditions of possessing their properties and operating them cannot be stopped, cannot be alienated. Of course, there is a growing number of Russian citizens who would like to come and who enjoy their properties along the Black Sea coast. And we definitely have to admit that part of them are actually members of networks which are operating that kind of Russian influence that we are discussing today. Well, this is the answer to this question is not inviting Russians along the Black Sea coast to go home, all of them, but the answer to this question is to try to develop the capacities of Bulgarian security services to the level to which they can neutralize that kind of attempts on behalf of networks operating within the Russian communities across the Black Sea coast.
I would just add one quick thing to that is, well, on the one hand, it is good to see that Russians prefer to own property in Bulgaria as compared to Russia. And that does suggest they have greater confidence in the security of property rights in Bulgaria than they do with respect to Russia. So it's a kind of almost vote of confidence in Bulgaria. On the other hand, there are, as Ognyan mentioned, and as the questioner mentioned, there is the question of the security and whether some of those people buying property are doing so on behalf of very unwelcome interests. And there undoubtedly are some. But when I've been in Varna, where there are quite a few Russians, there's no question that a lot of them, I think, are doing it not on behalf of the Russian government, but purely because they see it as a very nice area, and you'll love the Black Sea coast. So it's hard to balance that, the very unsavory aspects of it, and then the other almost welcome aspects.
Yes,
Yeah,
please, Velizar.
Just to add to this, because I think it is important, many of the Russians that living or have property in Bulgaria, actually, as Mark mentioned, recognize that Bulgaria is much better place than Russia when it comes to freedom, democracy, and opportunities. So it is good sign. I think in addition to strengthening our counterintelligence and security forces, as Ognyan proposed, it is we to be much more cautious when it comes to Russian business in Bulgaria, including Lukoil, including new investments. So it is more about our precautions and our capability to manage this type of activities, investment and counterintelligence, but not to blame Russian people, Russian citizens, or people with dual citizens, because it is exactly what President Putin expects, there to be hostile attitude and hostile action against people with Russian citizenship or dual citizenship in order to develop his rhetorics. We have to look at Lukoil and the Russian industry and the Russian companies operating, and to reduce our vulnerabilities when it comes to defense, energy, and education and research. Still, our education system, with all the massive investments coming from European Union, is too much dependent on Russian methods. And for example, in the area of space research and nuclear research, still the links are too close with Russia and not enough developed with European Union and United States, for example.
Thank you. Next question is from Theodora Broid, and she has a question for Mr. Kramer. Are NATO and the US actually worried that the possibly greater presence of NATO or greater US-Bulgarian cooperation on Bulgarian soil might be translated by Russia as a provocative standoff against Moscow?
No, I mean, the Russian government, of course, did denounce, routinely would denounce this sort of crackdown. Sergei Narishkin, the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service in Russia, said that Russia doesn't carry out such operations in Bulgaria. No one takes that seriously. That's the propagandistic denial that is typical of Russian intelligence services. I think there was, on the one hand, US officials, and again, there is a transition in Washington as well. This is a new government in Washington. I think the attitude under the Trump administration was much more deferential to Russia than it should have been. Whereas under or at least a failure on the part of the president especially, not so much the people in the Defense Department and the State Department, but it was really the president who was the problem. But under the current administration, I think there is going to be a much firmer line taken toward Russian malevolent activities throughout the Balkans, but particularly in Bulgaria. And so that's why as soon as the arrests were announced on the 19th of March, and by the way, I should add, by all indications, US officials did provide information that helped in uncovering the networks. And I will say that Bulgarian counterintelligence came out of it looking pretty good, given the extensive evidence that they amassed, the surveillance tapes and the videos and other such things. I mean, this was a network that had clearly been under watch for some time. The timing of the announcement, may have been sort of made to come just before the election. But regardless, I think it gave U.S. officials a real boost in sort of the hope of working with Bulgarian counterintelligence to try to uproot some of the Russian networks in Bulgaria.
And let me now connect Jamestown's yesterday event on Turkey with today's event on Bulgaria. We have a question from Ishik Gürleyen. How does Bulgarian government perceive the recent policy oscillation of Turkish government between NATO, US, and Russia? Secondly, in relation to the Erdogan government's recent signal for possible changes in the Montreux Convention, would Bulgaria perceive such a change in status quo as a threat? I would like to ask you both, Velizar and Ognyan, to answer this question because it's really connecting the region much more concisely.
Yeah, I could start serving for quite some time in NATO. Of course, we are not discussing relations with our allies publicly if there are concerns, because there is an excellent mechanism in NATO for consultations among the allies. But in this specific case, of course, it is quite disturbing when we see closer cooperation between Turkey and Russia. And it is something that is actually making cooperation in the Black Sea even more challenging. So this requires Bulgaria to consider developing a long-term strategy when it comes to Black Sea, much closer working with Romania, working with Greece, considering we are not only NATO members, but EU members as well. The 3C initiative, where US are involved as well, and it includes all the Eastern European countries between Adriatic, Black, and Baltic Sea, is another good platform, mixing security with economic development, with technology innovation. So there are several mechanisms to move forward without blocking ourselves by situation around Turkey and Turkish policy that is sometimes deviating for what was our expectation from the early days of cooperation, where actually Turkey was a prominent ally supporting Bulgarian membership in NATO and helping a lot in our preparation for this. So it is a very delicate environment, but I think there is enough space for maneuvering by Bulgaria, working in different formats and pursuing national interests when it comes to Black Sea and Western Balkans without confrontation with Turkey, but using our neighboring relations for finding solutions on the basis of principles already established.
We have only 5 minutes, and I have a couple of really good questions, but Ognyan, would like to add something to the question about Turkey?
Yes, actually, yes. The outgoing government of Mr. Borisov was trying to deal with the issue of Turkish strategic strength, strategic power, by developing closest possible relationships between both countries at any preconditions. But I would like to share with the participants a story which is 16 years old. In 2005 in Ankara, I was asked by Turkish think tankers and diplomats. Why do we accept in Bulgaria those so-called American bases? Because they said American presence is a threat for us all, literal countries. I answered that Bulgaria faces challenges to its security not from the United States, but from Russia and Turkey indeed. So they stopped the conversation. Actually, this is a division line. This is a division line which precedes the deviation of Turkey from being a full-fledged member of NATO and the West into occupying a more compromised position. And this example could be showing the real flexibility with which smaller countries in the region have to deal in the regional context in order to guarantee their security.
I have a question about energy, a very short one. I'm going to answer it very quickly because we don't have time. Judy Oken is asking, what is the benefit for Bulgaria to be part of the Russian energy network? There is no benefit to be part of one network. It's never been, and it never will be. Bulgaria needs to diversify gas supplies, oil supplies, needs to even diversify its energy, nuclear fuel supply, nuclear reactors as well, in order to be less dependent on one source. Regardless whether it's a Russian source or another source, it has to be diversified from several sources, as Turkey is doing at the moment pretty successfully, diversifying all its gas supplies and reducing Russian influence. No benefit other than for certain people on high positions within the energy companies in particular, and very often within governments, different cabinets, who benefit directly from Russian corruption. Because the payment for being on these boards and the payment for not doing the reforms that need to be done in the energy system is pretty significant for a poor country like Bulgaria. And this is answering also Georgeta Bojanova's question about why reforms haven't been done in Bulgaria under so many governments since '89. They have not been done because there has been a very serious opposition within the energy structures to any kind of reform. When I mentioned, we consider the interconnector to Greece a newer project, the last 3 years was 5 years. No, it's more than 25 years. It has been successful because there has been always resistance within the energy structures of Bulgaria to do that, to connect Bulgaria with another gas sources that could reduce dependence on Russia. A question for Mark Kramer. It says here only if we have time, but it's a good question and I wanted to ask it. It's concerning Albania, and would you consider lesser influence Russian propaganda exerts on Albania an inheritance of the Cold War history of Albania with Soviet Union, and then the Sino-Soviet confrontation and Albania's relations with China, switching sides several times? But I would like to add something to that question. Does Russian strategy of subversion always succeed? When what we saw in the Balkans, in Montenegro, in North Macedonia, it didn't actually succeed. It actually failed pretty spectacular.
Yeah, I mean, the Montenegro case came very close, dangerously close in my view, but particularly given that Montenegro then became part of NATO soon thereafter. But still, you're right, it was thwarted. And similarly, the efforts to inflame tensions between North Macedonia and Greece, ultimately did not prevent the agreement between them from being ratified. And so it doesn't always work. With regard to Albania, Albania had basically broken ties with the Soviet Union starting in the early 1960s, and then formally in 1968 it broke all ties and left the Warsaw Pact. And then it was aligned with China for several years, but when China began its rapprochement with the United States in the early 1970s, Albania became even disaffected with Mao in China, and it turned into itself and became almost a hermit country, something like North Korea, one that relied only on itself. And remained in that position through the end of the communist era. Enver Hoxha had died in 1985, and he was succeeded by Ramiz Alia, and he remained, he began to integrate Albania a little bit more into the rest of the world, but it remained basically an isolated country through the early 1990s. Now, in the post-communist period, Albania has certainly made an active effort to become part of Europe. It is not yet a member of the EU. It's a poor country, very poor country. And so it's going to have to wait some time before it becomes a member of the EU. But it is already a member of NATO and has had fairly close ties with the United States. The intervention over Kosovo in 1999 really solidified US ties with Albania and has made it very difficult, I think, for the Russians to try to get any foothold in Albania. So it's a quite different case, I would say, from the others we've been discussing. By the way, I fully agree with what my colleagues said about Turkey. And I should add, from the US perspective, it's at least as a matter of concern about, not only Turkey's overtures with Russia, but also internally what has gone on in Turkey. It's a very troubled relationship at this point.
I have to close the panel. We are past our time. We have more questions to be answered. I would like to ask our listeners, to our audience, to send the questions to the Jamestown address on the website of jamestown.org. You can find the address to contact us, and we will try to ask our panelists separately to answer them. 3 words from each of you as a closing remarks. Velizar, please.
Yeah, I think now we have a chance with all the experience and actually with the new American administration that is interested in resolving this issue to put the real program for change, but it will require commitment as we used to have in '97 when we made the big change for this civilization choice. I think we are at the same type of situation right now, and I'm looking forward to work closer with our American colleagues and inside NATO to find solution of these issues.
Thank you. Ognyan? You are muted. Yeah.
I would say that security issues and security improvement in Bulgaria is part of a general process of improving the functioning of the institutions of the country. What we have as a negative tendency in the last years, and I would say in the last decade, and a bit more than a decade, is a relative weakening of the institutional strength vis-a-vis problems of corruption, problems of efficiency, and problems of transparency of institutional activities. So changing this environment with a focused political effort will contribute indirectly and directly to the strengthening of security institutions and the security predicament in particular.
Thank you. And last word is to Mark.
Okay, I think that the extent of the recent revelations, going back to 2020 with the Russians who were kicked out of Bulgaria, earlier Malinov's espionage charges, and then the 6 people who were arrested this year. I think there is now a pretty widespread recognition of the security problem in Bulgaria. It remains to be seen how effectively it will be dealt with. And I'm very hopeful it will be, but I'm not certain of it.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your participation today. It was invaluable contribution to the debate. I hope that Jamestown is going to host other panels as soon as we have a government, maybe engage with government officials as well on these important issues, because they are directly concerning the security of Bulgaria, the transatlantic relations, our position, Bulgaria's position in NATO, Bulgaria's position in the European Union, as well as the regional success of Euro-Atlantic integration. Thank you.
Very good.